morning. Thank you ever so much for inviting me. I'm the educational geek, and they don't let me out very often to talk in the sports world, so I'm really excited to be here. My brief today is to talk to you around the teaching, coaching aspect, and to hopefully highlight some of the things that you well and truly all know, but also some of the aspects of what we're looking for in terms of that good practice. So I thought it would be useful from a background of an educationalist, a secondary PE teacher, and working with primary schools over the last sort of 7 or 8 years with the Youth Sport Trust, just to kind of set the context and remind us of the difference between coaching, sport and teaching and physical education. Some of which, as Ali said, not to teach you to suck eggs, but it's kind of useful to be set that context. So when I kind of looked at it, I was like, sport. I remember back at school, there were 3 of us, 3 girls, God forbid my poor dad who had to cope with 3 girls, and we were a particularly active family, but my middle sister wasn't. Her experience through sport was very different to mine. And when I looked at this quote in terms of sport and that competitive physical activity, formal, informal, I absolutely believe that if she'd have had an experience like I did, she would have been totally switched on and engaged, and would be a totally different person that she became in her experience. So it was important to reflect for me as I was planning for today about what is it about sport. And sport does inspire, as Ali said. I've experienced from watching little ones just representing the school, even though they might not have necessarily got to the highest point compared to others, just wearing the school badge, representing their school, inspires them. To those that have been identified very early and can see the pathway through to potentially representing their country at the next Olympics, it does inspire, and without it, there isn't that context for our youngsters to want to take that next step. And I think that's what reminds me in terms of my sister, that she never quite had that, to be able to take that step to see the power of sport that maybe my younger sister and I had. So if that's sport, what's coaching? And again, I'm standing in front of a set of amazing professionals who are those coaches. But in terms of, for me, it's that direction and that person, and bringing back to what Ali said about sports changes lives. There are youngsters who, in schools, who have teachers every day, and teachers are doing a phenomenal and very challenging job, as most of you will be aware. But sometimes that person that comes in from outside, that coach that brings in a different set of skills or views, is just as inspiring. And it's really important when we're looking at the coaching side of things, when we talk about the individuals, the teams, what skills you can bring. So that's just a reminder in terms of sport and coaching. And I love this quote. I had to use it from Sports Coach. Okay, I just think it's brilliant. It sums up what my dad was trying to do. He never got to the levels of you guys in the room and online, but it's that expression, so not standing inside lines, being able to really make a difference in terms of the sport that you're passionate about. I think it's a fantastic quote. So mine's not Ali at the end, it's sort of in the middle. But from an education point of view then, what's education? What are we talking about when we talk about education? And most of us, and particularly at the moment, in the light of the changes in education, I think what's being put through the media and what schools are being challenged all the time is it's an education for a job in the real world. Well, what is the real world? And for me, particularly, it's the second statement. It's about developing that child beyond. And I think it came to light for me particularly where I would have the pleasure of going out to India to work with the Indian government and to look at some of the work they were doing around teacher training. And we know they're a nation growing economically. We know that they're achieving massive things. But watching the universities and the training around academic rigour, and they are coming out of universities with the most amazing academic qualifications, but then talking to people that actually there are 3 things that they are clearly missing. So they have got the label, they are able on paper to get a job, but they have been positioned and dictated to in terms of how they learn. So they can't necessarily think for themselves. Their communication is poor. Their ability to work as a team isn't strong enough, and particularly in that setting, their ability to problem solve. So realistically, yes, education is about getting a job, but it's actually about developing that whole child to be able to cope with the variety of challenges that life and society provides us with. And we still hear it from the FTSE 100 companies. We have our massive youngsters coming up with some really amazing grades. The challenges of getting as a doctor, hundreds of students getting the right qualifications and they're having to sift through. But those FTSE 100 companies say the three things, we've already said, communication, teamwork, problem solving, are lacking. So as educationalists, we need to continue to put the whole of the child at the heart of what we're doing. So from a teacher's point of view, as we've said, what are we looking for? It's the facilitated learning. And there is a resonance here that links really clearly. I remember listening to Dave Brailsford talking about putting the crown on the performer, the crown on the athlete, and taking it off from the coach in terms of responsibility. And as teachers, that's an as of where they're aiming for as well. It's facilitating young people to take responsibility for their learning. But the most important thing here, I think, where the difference is in initial teacher education, the teachers are trained that the child is first, the subject second. And through coaching, it's the other way around. The subject or the sport is first, the participant in that sense is within that second position. So realistically here, what we're talking about is that progression of the whole child. So we're looking at the child first and identifying where they're at to identify what is needed from the range of subjects that they're looking towards. I think the knowledge and skills piece here is crucial from the teachers, having those knowledge and skills, those youngsters to be able to, and Ofsted quote this now, education ready. Are they educationally ready to take the next step in their journey? So if they are moving from early years foundation stage, so that's our nurseries, preschools, into formal education, are they education ready? Are they education ready when they leave their primary schools and they move into secondary? Do they have the skills, the knowledge, the ability to be able to take that next step? And I think it's really important to highlight here in terms of roles and responsibilities, because the child is at the heart of it, and particularly in primary schools, that those teachers are teaching every subject. That cross-curricular learning is vital, being able to make those connections. As Ali said, things happen quickly for youngsters now. They can get them, they're accessed. And I think even 7 or 8 years ago, my sister, her ability to feel that she could start at the bottom and get there in one very quick year, whereas my experience is you worked your way up the ladder because things were instant. Well, why can't I? And we have youngsters who are exactly the same as that. Why can't I? So in terms of that connectivity, it has to be relevant. If it's not relevant, even now we're seeing 6 and 7 and 8 year olds. I watch my son, he's not even 5, but there has to be relevancy for him to engage in what he wants to learn and develop. If there is no relevancy, then he switches off from it very quickly. I'm still struggling to understand the relevance of Alvin and the Chipmunks, having sat and watched it with him on Saturday, but absolutely there has to be some relevancy in their context. From a teaching, they are responsible for assessment. You'll hear it all the time. We need to ensure that our youngsters are making progress, and assessment is a clear part of that. But it's assessing them again as a whole child in terms of where they're developing, what they know, what they understand, what they can do, where they're progressing. And finally, from the roles and responsibilities, that inclusion piece, and that's not just those youngsters with disability, it's every single child, meeting the needs of every single child. And I think it was summed up brilliantly for me by a young girl who was on her final managed move. So she was literally about to be kicked out of the education system. And through a programme that we did, she started to understand the challenges of teachers. And her phrase to me was, "Oh, miss, they have a challenging job, these teachers. You've got to meet the needs of 30 individual students every hour, 5 hours a day, and you've got marking, and you've got bus duty, and you've got fixtures." Suddenly it was like, wow. Understanding the challenges that are faced and that inclusion of gifted and talented children with special educational needs, dyslexia, dyspraxia, low self-esteem, a disability, a broken home, looked after child, that's massive. And that ability to understand the child and what they need and when they need it in order to make progress is vital. So from a PE point of view, what is it we want? What is it we need? I'm sure that some of you will be aware of, and it relates into my title, of that physical literacy journey. And what we've been working hard with primary schools to do is to understand, particularly for the generalist, and all of you will know, on average it's about 6 hours of training. God, if I was asked to teach maths on 6 hours of training, would I be in a lot of trouble? I have enough trouble as it is trying to balance my own books, let alone having to teach maths. But 6 hours in actually what is deemed, even though we say physical education for the generalists, they're still thinking sport. So when they hear gymnastics, they're thinking Beth Tweddle. When they hear football, they're thinking David Beckham. And actually what we're saying is, if you're putting those sports in your vision at 5 and 6 year olds, that's like asking a 5-year-old, like my son, to read Othello. That's in essence what we're asking those youngsters to do. So actually what we're saying to those teachers, it's around movement, it's around that movement base for life. And yes, it is the fundamental movement that we talk about in the physical sense, but that's the platform to shape their social, their thinking, their creative, their healthy, and their leadership skills. So actually, if we take a primary school teacher on a journey of, you can't get them to write a word without teaching them the alphabet. You can't get them to write sentences without them understanding how to spell words. Sentences to paragraphs, paragraphs to short stories to the full-blown book. And it's the same context. And when you do that for a teacher, particularly a primary teacher, their light bulb moment comes on. They can see the relevance to their connection. But what they are able to do, because of being the teacher, they're in a position of very much knowing what it is they learn and how they learn in other subjects. They can make those connections, again, making it relevant. So as we said, it's the platform, and as Ali's alluded to, that leadership skills. It amazes me sometimes the depth of young people, and again, reeling it back to my son, we walked up the Malvern Hills on Saturday, and at 4.5 he was adamant that he was going that way and I was going that way because he could do it on his own. It was absolutely clear that he was going to take his own leadership path. Pointed out that Mummy was slightly worried about not being able to see him, but even at that age, they are clear about what they want to or are able to do. So what's the impact then from teaching point of view? It's achieving that potential as a learner, and a learner as in the whole context of them learning, inspiring them to want to learn beyond school as an individual. And it is, isn't it, about the subject and the teacher. To this day, history has always been a complete mystery to me, and I'm sure it was because of the teacher that I had at the time wasn't inspiring, wasn't relevant, wasn't engaging, but it's about achieving that potential. It's about the young people knowing what they can do, what they understand and what they're able to achieve. And here particularly, it's around the broader context of that moral, cultural, spiritual, social aspect and engaging them in that lifelong learning. So that's the teacher's impact if they've done a great job. More importantly then, because that's the challenge that I was presented, is what does this look like from a coach's point of view? So we know that primary teachers particularly are really struggling with their confidence levels, their ability to. So first of all, it's the teacher's role to develop that whole child in the PE curriculum. It's their responsibility. But there are aspects and plays in terms of what we would need them to do. Head teachers are telling us that with this primary premium money, that they want to look at that investment around lifelong sustainable impact on quality teaching. So that means professional development for their teachers. And we know from 2 experiences, I had, sounds like I go on a lot of international trips, Ali, I don't honestly. I had the pleasure of going out to New Zealand sort of 5 or 6 months ago, and their setting is very unique. So they have pure physical education teachers who teach the PE curriculum, but on the books in that school, they have sports coaches who teach the extracurricular and the clubs and the competition. And the connectivity between the two isn't there. Australia took the remit, and this is where we know from, actually sport dominating those sports, that they removed physical education as a subject with its importance and positioned purely coaches in that setting. And within 2 years, physical education disappeared. And within those 2 years, the numbers of young people that were participating in clubs dramatically dropped because it was no longer an option in school. It was no longer compulsory. At the moment, every single young person in England has to access and given the right to physical education. If we lose that, then we lose massive numbers of young people who have to engage, and that's our opportunity to inspire them. Alice talked about young people in terms of health. We have an issue, we have a challenge. Parents necessarily seeing the relevance. And if they're coming into primary school overweight or obese, we have a responsibility to ensure those youngsters, where they have to engage, get the best quality experience. But, as we said, in terms of coaches, our absolute vision is about you upskilling, and it's about you developing those teachers, not de-skilling and replacing them. And for us, the legacy, and very much the legacy, and I know it's the challenge, and I'm talking about utopia, but it's about getting those teachers to lead those conversations. Schools and the teachers need to take responsibility for that subject. There is no way, and I heard this quite recently, where a teacher was quoted saying, "We don't have time to plan and prepare for our PE lessons. Okay, we don't have time to do that." Now, if a head teacher was to hear that around numeracy and literacy, they'd go ballistic. Okay, we need to be in a position where we are supporting those teachers so they know and understand where their strengths and areas for development are. They know where they need to use you as coaches to develop and upskill them and their staff. They need to understand where are the direction of travel and what they need to be doing in physical education. If they were to take that same attitude for numeracy and literacy, I think not only the head teachers but Ofsted, but Mr. Gove would have something to say about it. Coaches supporting teachers and facilitating the teacher to take the lead in where coaches are needed is absolutely what Ofsted are looking for. Ofsted are clearly supporting coaches positioned in the right way, at the right time, directed and developed by those primary teachers. And it will be our sort of vision to support you guys as coaches to play that role in facilitating the teacher to take the lead. Not just coming in and them saying, "Well, I'm a bit nervous and therefore could you do it for me?" Supporting them to identify where are their strengths, where are their developments, and how are we going to upskill you? How are we going to develop you as an outstanding teacher and an outstanding teacher of physical education? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo. If you hang on for a moment, because we've got time for a couple of questions. I think Jo has very clearly positioned the role of the coach going into schools. I think perhaps you left out one part of it, which is the teachers upskilling the coaches, because, of course, all the teachers have that raft of skills in terms of putting the child right at the heart. But we'll take that as read. Now, do we have any questions for Jo? Do I see a hand going up over there?
Hi, my name is Paul Smith from the Great Sportsmanship Programme. Thanks. Hi, my name is Paul Smith from the Great Sportsmanship Programme. Was that from the Olympic Charter or the values of Olympism? I was delighted to see your inspirational talk about developing physical, social, moral, cultural and spiritual aspects, because it's something we promote in the Great Sportsmanship Programme. I'm wondering, does it come from you or does it come from 2,000 years ago?
It doesn't come from me. It comes from Ofsted, actually. Part of the Ofsted framework looks at the behaviour and safety, and within behaviour and safety and leadership and management of the school, it's the school's responsibility to develop their social, moral, cultural and spiritual aspects of the all young people that go through their system.
And do the schools understand that principle,
yeah,
of how broad your remit is?
Absolutely. It's part of, if you look at the Ofsted inspection framework, it's very clearly part of what they do, and under the primary premium, that's where they're positioning PE taking a role, is around that area, as well as obviously leadership and management, where they will be asking the very fundamental questions, is what difference, what impact has this funding had on all your young people, and they have to be able to evidence that, and therefore it brings it back to we could be in a position, and certainly not what we want to be in, is if we use this money and investment into supporting our teachers to be better, it creates a lasting legacy. If it's invested elsewhere, and that is the easy option, all the experts in the room here will do a phenomenal job, and without a doubt, young people will make progress in a certain aspect, but not that broader holistic. And then we've had teachers not teaching PE for 2 years, they come back in, and we run the risk of, in 5 years' time, no physical education. So physical education at the heart of that social, moral, cultural is vital, but also it's really important a leadership and management responsibility of the school that they understand what difference they're trying to make.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
And you highlighted the potential problem that they've seen in Australia.
Yes, absolutely. And talking to New Zealand, they're very clear. They have their own challenges. The sport and the phys ed, as they call them, don't talk. And there's a massive gulf because they are increasing skill and participation through a holistic approach, a values-based holistic approach in PE, but there's no communication with sports coach. So it's the same old 30% that get selected and get the opportunity, and they're missing that 70%. So we were very much sharing about different examples of how coaches and the physical education teachers should be working together, and some of that is absolutely best practice in this country. But it's really interesting to see the cultural difference between how physical education teachers in New Zealand are deemed and how sports coaches are, even though they're still employed by the school and under the same roof. Never the twain shall meet almost in some schools.
Now, we've had our first question in from Twitter, so a reminder to those of you watching online that you can tweet your questions in throughout the day. So a question for Joe, what challenges do you anticipate for coaches in PE and school sport with the advent of the new curriculum?
The challenges will be that it's quite narrow in its sense, and if you are working with a school who might not have had the support necessarily, they might look to take it in a very narrow traditional route, and actually not putting the heart of the young people again, the needs of those youngsters. So I think it could go that way. You are, as coaches as well, particularly if it does go very narrow, what is offered extracurricular-wise could again be quite narrow and compact, and particularly when we're looking at the health side and engaging those children who are sort of the ones that wouldn't necessarily engage in PE and sport from their own background and what they're experiencing from their parents, might engage in a more non-traditional alternative type approach, might be limited to see that if that goes that way. But the positive side is the national curriculum is so generic that actually looking at it by putting what do my young people need, where do we want to take them, what's the vision for physical education, what type of young person we're trying to develop. If we take that approach, then the world's the oyster, because it's very generic in its view and we could go in any direction. So there's an opportunity and a challenge within that.
That's scary, Joe, because you haven't read the tweet, but you obviously anticipated the second half of the question. Okay, thank you. Oh, we've got one final question, and then we'll move on. Yep. And so your name is?
Hi there, my name's Rob George. I work at a primary school in Manchester, and I've also done CPD for teachers, offering gymnastics support. And my mum is, she looks after the PE, she has to train the teachers. I'm just wondering if you know of any novel approaches to developing and engaging teachers and making them enthusiastic about sport. Because my experience, my mum's experience, the head teacher at my school who's in charge of sport and has been head of PE in other schools, finds it very difficult to actually make them enthusiastic. And whilst we've got a room full of people here who are really enthusiastic about sport and, like you say, will go and make an impact, how can we actually impact the teachers? Because my observations are, they generally slip back into their folk pedagogies of, you know, the easy option and controlling PE and making it very dull and uninspiring. Okay. What do you suggest?
There's two parts. One is understanding that they probably have had a negative experience themselves. So they probably were that young person who had to stand dressed in their vest and knickers as a tree, or stand on the outside of a hockey or rugby pitch completely soaking wet, not knowing how to access because they didn't have the physical skills. And I understand that, because many primary head teachers, when I explain my job, they usually start going grey and sweating because it relives their own experience. So understanding that is a start. But I would suggest taking the word sport out if that's what's making them anxious, and talk about the physical literacy and a movement-based journey and relating it through to what they do in literacy every day. Because when you do that, the relief on the face to start off with, and some will need a context of this is where we're going, this is where we're going to take them to, so they're able to access a range of, but let's start with the movements that these young people need, because when you do that, the teacher has probably more strategies up their sleeve than you do on how to do that, because they do it day in, day out. So when you look at how they're differentiating their teaching, in literacy, how they can get them to work in different groups, reading groups. And I think the one bit that you can support is when a child is struggling in numeracy and literacy or is gifted and talented, a teacher instantly knows how to move them on. And actually, we call it the 3 E's. And if we're doing a brilliant job in PE, then we need more of you to enable, enrich or enhance. So if we are enabling, i.e. children who in the 2 hour of PE is still not quite making the physical development mark, how in extracurricular or at lunchtimes can we enable them? So we will have literacy support groups. We might have little reading groups to get them to the next level. How can we do the same thing in PE and sport? And that could be exactly where your skills are required to support that. But how can we enrich them? I.e. some of the youngsters here in Manchester or anywhere in the northwest, anywhere in the UK, might never get an access to a sport or an experience through their parents, through their own life settings. How can we enrich them that way? Or how can we enhance them just to the next level, i.e. you've spotted someone who could be the next gymnast. How do we get them connected to the right pathway so they continue to want to keep going through their educational journey? So
super. Thanks, Jo.